Attention startup leaders. Are you strapped for time but hungry for strategic insights? Introducing Managed Chaos, your go-to podcast for navigating the startup world in less time than your morning commute. Join us as we share expert advice, real-world examples, and actionable strategies to help you scale your business, allocate resources effectively, and achieve visionary results. Tune into Managed Chaos and join a community of like-minded innovators on the path to entrepreneurial success.
Automation feels like an easy win. Fewer people, so teams are rushing to automation to create efficiency. But that may not always be the answer. Welcome to the Managed Chaos podcast, where we give you the startup business rundown in less time than it takes for you to get to work. I'm Rachel Anderson.
And I'm Katrina Purcell.
And today, we're talking about automation of your everyday processes. So Katrina, I know automation has basically become synonymous with AI, but we're not really touching AI today. We're touching pure automation plays. So tell me, automation feels like an easy way to solve a problem of efficiency, but how can it go wrong?
So where I've seen it go wrong is if you're trying to automate something that you don't actually understand. So let's say you have a process that isn't going well. Maybe it's a cross-functional process between teams, and there are a lot of manual steps that feel like extra work, and it's creating a lot of confusion. The team may rush to try to automate. And I have a client who had this problem between two systems. And the thought was, well, it's just because we're doing this manual work. If we automate it, everything will make sense. And the trouble there was that they didn't actually know what they were automating. So, I think a lot of systems, Monday.com, for instance, right, makes it very easy to set up automations. But you really need to understand what you're automating. What fields are you changing when what happens, right? Or what boards are you moving things to? And what are the triggers for that to happen? And you really can't do that until you've dug into the process itself. And I find that sometimes teams feel like they're too busy in the day-to-day to actually zoom up to that 36,000-foot view and think about what the process really looks like or should look like. And in some cases, it might take training someone new on it to understand that, wait a minute, we probably don't have this documented well, and we're about to automate something that actually doesn't make sense. And that's what happened with one of the teams that I'm working with. And it's really just so important that when you think about automation, you think about it from the concept of you should have that process down pat. It should be, you could do it in your sleep, right? Because then when you automate it, it's becoming faster and you're freeing up that human element, but you know what you're automating and the outcome, you know what outcomes you're expecting, and you know how you're measuring success.
Yeah, I love that you're talking about automation from a perspective of knowing the goal and the outcome. Like, you need to know what the process is or the idea in order to get automation to work. I immediately thought about this one time. I had to overhaul an entire marketing organization's process of idea concept to like implementation of said concept. And through that was content creation and planning and all the things, right? And because I, at that point, only held probably 50% of that process as part of, my own responsibilities, it required a lot of interviews, a lot of curiosity, a lot of questions of all the individuals that had a stake in that process. So really that meant, someone from every part of the marketing department and some of the outside departments like sales, marketing operations, which isn't always in the marketing department, which is why I, mentioned that. And that was a really critical component to me being able to optimize process, which then meant automation as part of the optimization of the process. And so I think that you're right. We underestimate so frequently that piece that you have to understand the process in order to do actual automation. The other thing I've seen is where I know you're going next, which is really fascinating because I think that there is one other path towards figuring out that automation piece and those processes. So tell me, what do you need to make automation truly successful?
So I am a really big fan of SOPs, or standard operating procedures. I think it really, a lot of teams feel like why do I need to do this? We already know what we're doing, but it's not documented, right? And the thing is that in growing organizations, you're constantly having new teams be part of a process. You're constantly hiring. You might be experiencing people moving between departments and taking on new responsibilities. And unless that process is documented, unless you really understand what the SOP looks like, it's really hard for you to start to think about how to create efficiencies in that process. So even if the efficiency might not be automation, maybe the efficiency is it's in a tool currently and it should be in a different tool. I think in some cases we might have created a process that actually becomes a process that's obsolete because we got new systems and now we actually don't need need the process we had before, but we never stop to think about it because we just keep doing the day-to-day. Mm-hmm. And so to me, SOPs are living, breathing documents. They essentially become sort of that checklist. So, everyone always loves to talk about that pre-flight checklist. You always got to make sure that you go through and that everything is done before you take off, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the SOP to me becomes sort of the documentation of all the people involved, of what the actual process is, but it's something that someone can have up on their second monitor and walk through if they're new and say, okay, I know now exactly how to do this click by click. Mm-hmm. And it's not a training manual. It's really more about the process. Who am I talking to? How are things going between systems? And creating that process flow, which goes at the top of your SOP, will help you to understand where you can automate, where maybe something isn't in a system now, but could be in a system in the future, and also how to consolidate some of your systems. Because we get technology sprawl is pretty big in startups, especially now when you can get so many different free SaaS solutions. Next thing you know, marketing is using Trello, other departments are using Monday.com, other departments are using something else, and then you don't even have a single project management tool and you don't know, what's being tracked where, and it just creates confusion. So getting those processes documented, understanding the systems, just document. I know I'm really boring, but to me that actually creates the baseline and the foundation for scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I'm hearing you say is that automation doesn't always mean efficiency, even though we think that to be efficient, we should automate. And so I think that is a genius. I'm going to write that as a catchphrase. I'm going to just be like, Katrina Purcell. But I was listening to this CEO a couple weeks ago, and they were telling their story of growth of their company, and they had incredible growth. I don't remember the numbers. It was like millions of dollars. But what I do remember is that they went from one store. They were in the medical spa space, but they went from one store to more than 30 franchised stores. And the CEO had started as a temp employee. And when she arrived at the company, she was asked to do whatever it was she was asked to do. And as part of that, she identified that they didn't have any SOPs. They had no standard operating procedures. And so it was her just personal goal in order to do a good job at her tasks to make an SOP. And from there, she just started making all the SOPs. And then it became this huge part of the business. It gave her a huge growth path. And she rapidly became the person in charge because she was the one that knew everything. She knew how everything worked, where everything was, the problems, the strengths. And that's how she really made her way into the CEO spot and then solidified her success in this huge expansion. And I just thought it was so funny. I was like, SOPs. I mean, who could say that they're more important than that person right there?
Exactly. The path to the CEO suite, guys, is SOPs.
That's right. That's, you know what? I'm going to use that as a secondary tagline for this episode. Okay, so we have our documentation, we have understanding the problem, we have these incredibly valuable SOPs. So you make your automation, but how do you know that it's actually working?
So in order to know if it's actually working, you have to have been able to measure the process before. So this is where data comes into play. You need to understand how long does it take you to complete the process or the task or whatever you're automating in the current state. And then once you get it automated, you need to be able to know, okay, well, how quickly is it happening now? The second element of that is it no longer requiring a person? So have you freed up any FTEs, full-time employees, any time from people on your team that can now be focused on other things? And it requires tweaking and rejiggering. So you can't just kind of put the automation in place, say, oh, great, it takes, it's 5 times faster. Awesome. As your company grows, as processes change, as teams adjust, you need to continually monitor. And it should be one of the KPIs that your operations team is looking at around, is this automation still continuing to help, right? Or is it starting to take longer than it used to, and why? As we add new systems, add new fields, start to enrich data. And so really going back and being able to understand, now that the team is taking on new tasks, what are they taking on? What have we done with the time savings? But also, are we still saving that time as time goes on?
That's a really great example of why I think sometimes people fear automation incorrectly, because you don't automate roles and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
You automate tasks, but that automation still has to be managed. That automation creates other things that you have to do, like measure it. And so I think that that's so important to acknowledge that just because you've automated something doesn't mean you have extra time. But if you have automated it, you could, and there's other ways you could use that. And the only way to know is by really being able to measure that according to other things that you do. I think that is just a perfect way to kind of summarize.
Yeah, and really, when you're automating something that is mundane, right? It's repeatable. It's maybe it's more than likely not something that you need someone really spending their human capital on, and probably isn't something that person enjoys doing anyway. And so by automating it, you're freeing them up to do more strategic things, to use their brain, to really be able to be more creative, and taking that sort of really mundane manual work off their plate.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, thank you, Katrina. Today was lovely, per usual. We talked about automation and how SOPs are the path to the CEO. So if you want to be a CEO, start with the SOP. This has been Managed Chaos Podcast. Like, subscribe, follow everywhere that you have listening and viewing capabilities, and we will definitely see you next episode.
This was another informative episode of Managed Chaos, the podcast for startups. You can find us on all of your favorite podcasting apps, as well as on Instagram and YouTube, where we are at Managed Chaos Podcast. For additional resources or to continue the conversation, you can find Katrina Purcell and Rachel Anderson on LinkedIn.